Hi folks, this is Jake from Tier 3 Tactical. Today we're going to be talking about how to scale WODs and Metcons. I've been doing functional fitness since around 2007, so quite a long time at this point. And I got to tell you, scaling is probably one of the most common mistakes I see athletes of all experience levels making. And there's a lot more to scaling than you probably think, so let's get straight into it. The first question we should really ask ourselves is, who should scale a WOD or Metcon? Now, traditionally, this is thought of as something for beginners to do or people that aren't quite as good at functional fitness. And this is probably the biggest misconception. It can be used for scaling for beginners and is used most commonly, but it does not mean that only beginners should do it. In my opinion, CrossFit, games athletes, and the newest person in the gym should scale at some form or fashion. Now, they're going to do it for different reasons, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't do it entirely. Most often, a beginner is going to be doing it because the WOD is just too hard for their current fitness level, or they don't have the required technique. But, let's look at a different example of why you might want to scale. If you're a very competitive athlete, you work out a whole lot, you have a lot of different sessions. Let's say you're getting ready to do a session that's going to tax your back, and it is still sore from heavy deadlifts a few days ago. Well, doing a session that's going to tax your back while it's still sore is going to bury you in a recovery deficit that you're probably not going to get out of, and that might ruin a week or two of your training. So you'd be smarter to either substitute the movement or maybe move your schedule around so you aren't working a really sore muscle group. Let's go over the top 5 reasons that you need to scale a WOD. The first one is lack of safe technique. Obviously, if you can't do a complex movement or even a simple movement safely due to mobility issues or technique issues, you shouldn't do it. Safety needs to come before intensity. Next is going to be lack of exercise capacity. Let's just say that you don't have the capacity to work out as hard as the WOD requires. It's asking for 10 rounds or something. That's too much. That's going to put you in too much of a deficit to recover, or you're going to be sore for too long to get more workouts in. There's no point in getting one workout in that's really hard that's going to ruin you for a whole week when you could do 3 or 4 moderately hard workouts and gain much more fitness from that. The next is going to be insufficient muscle group recovery. And that's kind of what we talked about above, where your back is still sore, your legs are still sore, and you have a heavy leg day. There's no point in just fighting through that. You're not going to have a good session, and you're ruining your recovery. Another one you might want to scale the WOD is overdeveloped capacity. And we're going to talk about that further on, but that's actually when you're too good at a certain type of movement or modality. And then lastly is injury. And that's pretty common. If you've injured a muscle group, you probably shouldn't work it super hard in the gym. The way I like to think about scaling is, first, you need to understand the intent of the WOD. And that is for the type of athlete that you are going to see in your gym, and that's your top quality athlete. So if you work out at CrossFit Mayhem with Rich Froning and that crew, that's going to be a different type of WOD that they're going to be doing than if I go there. I'm going to scale because I can't hang with those guys. Most gyms are going to be write WODs and programming for folks that can do these movements pretty well, that are pretty good athletes, the top 80 to 90 percentile athlete, depending on the kind of gym you work out in. So it's written for that type of person. We need to keep that in mind. Next, you're going to look at the WOD time domain. For that type of person, is this a 5-minute WOD? Is it a 25-minute WOD? Because obviously there's a big difference between the two. Anyone who's done a very hard 5-minute WOD, like your Fran, is going to tell you that's something much different than if you do like an EVO, which is a lot longer type of WOD. So understanding the time domain is going to tell you what energy systems are coming into play, how you should feel, and the general speed. Is it a high power output, moderate, or low? Running 5K is lower a power output than a Fran. A sprint, 100 meters, is higher power output, than a lot of other WODs. So you need to understand that, because that's going to determine what energy systems you use. The next is your weight intensity relative to your 1RM. So for the athlete that this program is written for, is that 225 deadlift, is that about a 50% load? Because if it is, that means whatever load you should be doing is around 50% as well. So that is very important. You don't want to just even though you could maybe do 225 for reps, but if you're only doing singles and doubles, that's going to be a much different WOD than if it was meant to be able to do sets of 10. So that's a big consideration right there. And next one would be WOD skill requirement. Do you have the skill for some of these very difficult movements, your muscle-ups, handstand walking, or handstand push-ups? If you don't have safe technique, or if your technique is not sufficiently safe that you can do it under fatigue, then you probably shouldn't do it, or you should modify it so you can do it safely. Because remember, just because I can do it fresh doesn't mean that I can do it when I'm 15 minutes into a WOD and I'm super tired and sweat's getting in my face and stuff like that. And lastly, if you decide to scale, you need to substitute the most like movement that there is. For example, if you can't do a muscle up, you should do the hardest version of a pull-up you have. That's functionally the same kind of movement, and a muscle up is predominantly a pulling movement. Yes, there's the dip portion, but that's easier compared to the pulling portion. So a chest-to-bar pull-up would be a good choice. If you can't do that, obviously the next hardest might be a pull-up or a ring row or something like that. But you're substituting like movements. Now let's talk about some less common reasons to scale a WOD. If you go back to that list above, you see we have a lot that some are, the new athlete can't do the movement, yeah, they're going to scale. If you're injured, yeah, you need to scale. But one that I've kind of already hit on a little bit is insufficient recovery. If you're very sore or you can't even warm up, you can't even get into the right positions because you're so sore, or if you're making dad noises whenever you get out of a chair or something like that, you're too sore to work those muscles again. Be smart and substitute either a day, which is what I like to do. So it's a leg day, but my upper body's still okay. I might do the upper body day that day and then do legs the next day. That's a pretty common one. Or maybe pick a slightly less challenging movement depending on the program that you're using. So that's a very common one. And this is one I see athletes ignore all the time. If you're a little sore, yes, you can train through it. But if you're super sore, you can't even get to the bottom of the squat without grimacing, no, do something else. The one I like to talk about is overdeveloped capacity. Now, this is not super common, but I do see it a lot. You get a marathon runner who's pretty good and did it for several years, or maybe ran in college or something like that. They're coming in to start lifting some weights and get in better shape overall. Well, if you have a WOD that's an 800-meter run and some deadlifts, that 800-meter run is not going to tax them at all. The deadlift will. So I might actually put more emphasis on the deadlift, so they are shoring up their personal weaknesses rather than letting them crush the WODs and get a really awesome win for this WOD. Now, I'm not saying you should do this every single time. Sometimes athletes just need they need an easy win, so let them do that. But if they're a killer runner and they're not a very good deadlifter, and you've got runs and deadlifts, makes sense to me to have them put more emphasis on the thing they are not as good at. So maybe increase the weight or have them do more reps or something like that. But that's going to help them personally become more fit rather than just do what's written on the board, even if they can do it as prescribed. And then getting to injury. This is kind of a pet peeve of mine. If you are an athlete and you work hard, you're going to experience injury. Most injuries are recoverable with some common sense, letting those muscles relax and recover, going to the doctor if you need to, but most don't even require that level of care. Obviously, your medical doctor or physical therapist is going to be your go-to for these kind of things, but if they've cleared you to come back to training, or it's a pretty moderate injury that you don't feel you personally need to go to those specialists for, you need to figure out what movements you can do. I'll tell you a quick story about working out with an injury. A few years back, I injured one of my knees doing something kind of dumb in the gym. But the long and short of it was I couldn't really bend my knee for past 45 degrees for a couple weeks. I couldn't squat. I couldn't really do deadlifts initially. But I realized I could do things like row without bending my knees and using my upper body to do most of the rowing. I could also eventually do some stiff leg deadlifts that didn't seem to bother my knee. And then obviously I had pull-ups, push-ups, upper body movements. So even though a knee injury can be pretty debilitating, you need to find things that you can do. I promise you there are still holes in your fitness that you can plug with enough work. So being injured or even being out of the game for a while isn't really an excuse. I think it was a video I was watching with Dmitry Klokov, and I think he said, if you can only move your finger, move your finger. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. The last thing I like to remind everyone when talking about scaling, is I get a lot of questions about it, is the minutia really doesn't matter. Should you have done chest to bars or regular pull-ups? Do I need to do pull-ups and then maybe some dips because it's slightly closer to a muscle up? That kind of stuff doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. Your body doesn't know what you should have done. It only knows if you're consistent. It only knows if you do the basics right. And it only knows how hard you work. So don't stress about what was written on the board. Get a good workout in and be smart. If you like this kind of article, I encourage you to share it with somebody that might be looking for this kind of information. And of course, put some comments below. Let me know what you thought and subscribe to the channel. Thanks, folks.